Panzer Dragoon represents the majestic promise of the Sega Saturn, and foreshadows why the system alienated so many people in the mid-1990s. I'm your man out of Japan, Jay Contra, and this review was made possible by my sponsors over at Patreon, where you can get access to patron-only videos and polls that determine the future of the channel. You've probably heard the name Panzer Dragoon sometime in your gaming career, but if you haven't played it, you might be thinking, what is Panzer Dragoon? Released worldwide in 1995 for the new Sega Saturn, Panzer Dragoon is one of my favorite rail shooters of all time. Taking place after the collapse of human civilization, you fly on an armored flying beast, fighting the genetically modified monsters that destroyed humanity and the evil empire that is trying to recapture the technology that created these horrors. If that sounds like not technically a Ghibli movie, but actually is a Ghibli movie, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, it's pretty close, but something almost entirely different. The 3D environments look gorgeous, and they're counterintuitively better than any remake can re-render. Because of the Saturn's limitations, they're designed in a way that hints at humanity's dead sci-fi future, just enough to let your imagination wonder what this civilization looked like at its height without giving too much detail. You have two ways of shooting at enemies, either with your semi-automatic laser gun or a homing blast that can target multiple enemies. My theory, and this may not be true, is that the homing weapon was deemed essential because of the janky-looking enemies on the screen. Most of the smaller enemies look like jagged, poorly rendered 3D polygons at most distances. Instead of being stuck with just your repeating laser weapon, which isn't that useful except in certain situations, you have to use your homing shot to even think of hitting targets. Overall, I felt the shooting to be very satisfying, and with just 6 levels and a final boss, Panzer Dragoon is an unfortunately short game. The arcade-like design will make you loop through the first few levels several times to learn enemy spawn patterns and boss timing, and you should quickly figure it out to the point that clearing the game will take less than 3 or 4 total hours of gameplay. And that's if you're bad at shooters like I am. And then you're finished, with not much reason to play after that. I don't mean to sell the game short, but the Majesty of Panzer Dragoon comes from a mystique inherent to the Sega Saturn, and it all starts with the name. Although Panzer can be a generic German word for armored vehicle or tank, because I've spent way too much time watching World War II documentaries on the History Channel, I mostly identify the word Panzer with an infamous series of German tanks used in the late 1930s and early 1940s. What I find really strange about a Japanese game's decision to use German words is that there are plenty of Franceaboos in Japan, people obsessed with French culture, perhaps on the level of Westerners obsessed with Japanese anime and the like. There are of course games like Xenosaga that use German in their titles like Der Wille zur Macht, but the use of German in a Japanese game title adds to the game's unique mystery. And Dragoon is much more esoteric, something my mind pictures as the mounted infantry used in the European wars of the 18th and 19th centuries, but I think the developers just wanted to use a fancy-sounding word for dragon. Other games like Final Fantasy and Legend of the Dragoon use the term, and Drakengard's original name in Japanese is Dragon Dragoon. Adding to the drama of Panzer Dragoon is its unique place in gaming history, and I think it's worth going back to 1995, a time when home consoles were transitioning from cartridge-based 2D games to CD-based 3D titles. Imagine that you're a kid and you've just got a Sega Saturn after being a faithful Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis player for the last 5 years. You're used to handling plastic cartridges and playing in 2D, but then you drop your new CD game into the Sega Saturn and blam! On comes the pre-rendered 3D opening movie. Horns blare at the start menu, announcing the next generation of video games like a trumpeter heralding the entry of a king. This was all made possible by, to most people at the time, an entirely new medium of video game. Titles released for the Super Nintendo around the same time were the apex of 2D gameplay, and just one day after Panzer Dragoon released in Japan, Chrono Trigger hit shelves, redefining 2D RPGs in unparalleled ways. Today, we can see the limits of Panzer Dragoon representing the drawbacks of the Sega Saturn. The system couldn't process 3D the same way that the PlayStation could, or the N64 would a year later in 1996. Many arcade games would get ported to both the PlayStation and the Saturn throughout their life cycle, but the real future of console games would be epics like Final Fantasy VII and Ocarina of Time, though these would come out a few years later. Panzer Dragoon has the ephemeral qualities that match these legends, and I dare say it exceeds those games with a stellar art design and an amazing soundtrack, but in strict gameplay terms, it does not match in either breadth or depth the heights that these signature games for the PlayStation or the N64 would reach. And if that doesn't describe the Sega Saturn, I don't know what does. But if you liked Panzer Dragoon, and I'm sure you will, then there are 2 whole other games to play. Panzer Dragoon 2 for the Saturn and Orta for the original Xbox. And then there's the RPG Panzer Dragoon Saga, though it is terribly difficult to acquire a physical copy. The first Panzer Dragoon has been remade a couple of times in different forms, but the original will always hold a special place as herald for a new generation of console games. Thanks for watching, and mahalo.